In-Sook Chappell in conversation with Moi Tran and Jennifer Tang. In-Sook, Moi and Jennifer are sat on chairs, spaced apart in a semicircle. Moi is sat on the left, In-Sook in the middle and Jennifer on the right. They are in a studio space in front of a large wooden door. In-Sook is a Korean woman with mid-length dark hair, wearing a blue dress and pink glasses. Jennifer is a Chinese woman. She has chin-length bobbed black hair and is wearing a sleeveless white shirt, light blue trousers and light-coloured high-top trainers. Moi is a Vietnamese woman and uses she, her pronouns. She has medium-length dark brown hair with a fringe and she's wearing a light brown and black leopard print jumpsuit.
Hello, my name's In-Sook Chappell and I wrote the Free9.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Tang. I'm a director and theatre maker. I'm going to be talking today about how I might approach directing the Free9.
Hello, my name is Moi Tran. I will be discussing scenography and costume design for the Free9 today.
So I guess thinking about characters feels really important to me. We keep coming back to this idea of research, but it feels really important to me that we're, one, thinking about each of these characters very specifically as individuals, and that we're not straying into a world of generalisations, and that it's everything that we do is backed up by huge, robust research. And of course we have to use our imaginations. I think it's really important that we aren't afraid to use empathy and imaginations, but I think if when working with these actors and these young actors, it's this duality of finding the research and letting that research then give you the freedom to play, rather than coming at it the other way around. I think I'm really interested in the effect of the experience on the body, because these are young bodies and they are going to take up different shapes and sizes on stage. And I think one of the ways to express individuality is to think about the different effects that the experience is having on their bodies, and also how they themselves view and hold their bodies. So we have Rat, for example, who is physically, it says in the text, is the smallest of the group, but because she is hiding herself, essentially, and passing herself as a boy, that need to hide and to disappear so she's not drawing attention to herself feels to me that, you know, the actor playing that role, I'd be really interested in how they start to disappear themselves, how they kind of always maybe position themselves in a place on the stage that is not front centre, you know, how and what it feels like to constantly kind of be aware of your body, to constantly be aware of how you might be perceived by others, and what that does to your body. Versus, for example, Moon, who is trying to be the leader of this gang, you know, is constantly maybe trying to take up more space than is available to him, because he's trying to assert himself all the time. And what he's doing when he's not speaking, you know, how is he always making himself present, making his presence felt? How does Poppy's body change when he's around Gia compared to when he's around Blade? So I'm really interested in a couple of things, I guess. One is the relationships that are playing out between the characters and how those things manifest in their body, not just through space, but also through their relationships towards each other in terms of proximity. I'm also really interested in the backstory and the history. What is it like to be constantly hungry? And what does that do to your body? What does it feel like to, you know, the Kochebi are constantly, I guess, kind of like in a state of heightened awareness.
Yeah. Hyper alert.
Hyper alert all the time, of danger coming at you from all the... So what does that do to your sense of focus? You know, I'm imagining that, and again, this is imagination, this isn't coming from research, but my imagination says that it's very hard to settle and be still. So what is that kind of interior energy that's happening versus the kind of exterior energy? And I guess the other thing that I'm thinking of as well is how do these children differ in terms of their relationship to the forgotten? Blade seems to have a much more pronounced relationship with the forgotten compared to Minnie, for example, who's actually trying to evade or not let herself have that connection. So it feels like to me the characters can play out lots of the nuance of their relationships just through the body, just through the way that they are navigating themselves and navigating themselves in relation to other people. And I don't know if any of that might ring true in terms of, I'm just thinking about costume, for example, as well, and if that's something that might start to play out in that visual sense.
I guess when thinking about costume, and first of all about, I guess, like the Free9, I was sort of playing with the idea where they may have found their clothes from, living on the street. Would they be oversized? Would they be more functional, as in some of the clothes are oversized? They perhaps are even adult clothes that they've sort of modified to fit themselves. Have they patched up, or are they ripped and just, you know, left to be ripped? And I also like the idea of the backstory, the history, and how that exerts itself on the body, and how costume might help to also support that idea in terms of like how they've improvised their clothing, where they've managed to steal, beg and borrow. Shoes, what do they look like? You know, like what sound? Boots, trainers, sneakers, flip-flops, like what sound does that make on the floor, you know, and how that might in itself inform some of that posturing, some of that character sort of posturing work that you're talking about, Jen. So that, I like the fact that most of the clothes, I imagine that most of the clothes are slightly big. Most of the footwear is slightly big, so they almost drag themselves, but they could look like adults. They could look androgynous, you know, that isn't really a choice.
Thinking about the fabric, so most North Korean clothes are made of fabric called vinylon, which is a kind of polyester and nylon that they make there. And then in North Korea, most people wear a uniform of some form, like to sort of to show what level you are and what work you do.
And I think that would be something I'd like to do a bit more research on, in terms of like the difference in clothing between adult and youth, because that would probably be slightly different. It differentiates itself, but and also the fact that they have had a period of traveling. Like, have they picked up anything on the way? Because the temperature has changed, you know, and so they need extra or less clothing. Like, how does that journey suggest itself? And the costuming of the Free9, the relationship of that aesthetic to the forgotten. Like, do we really examine the fact that in the world or the realm of the forgotten, it suggests the past. It suggests a period that is, and is that something that we visually also encapsulate in the costumes to differentiate, or is it not? Is it set within the sort of same, you know, period? Or, like In-Sook was saying, there is a more general sort of costuming or clothing of the forgotten, and that it is more true to the texture and the fabric that would be available in the, you know, generally in North Korea.
While you were talking, it was just making me think about, I think specifically shoes. I think you're right, there's something about shoes that I think we get very used to having our feet in good shoes, you know, and it just makes me think about exercises that I would do with actors, and to get shoes into a rehearsal room early, into a process early, can transform actually. Especially if you're thinking about what parts of the body that you might be leading from, you know, and if we're trying to find individual body shapes for these for these characters, you might make the decision that some characters are leading with different body parts, but those decisions will be really influenced by what shoes and clothes feel like on them. And like you were saying, the idea of research and that specificity, I think what can really help thinking about characterizations is mining the text for all of the given circumstances and finding these facts, like you say, the backstory, the facts that really back up who these people are, who these children are, will also influence how they interact with props, for example. So I'm just thinking of a really specific examples that have stuck with me is, how it's Rat that eats the ice cream, isn't it?
Yeah.
But she's never tasted ice cream before, and does that feel like? How does she handle the wrapper, this shiny wrapper, and this ice cream, and what it's like to have that feeling of cold in your mouth? Thinking about how the difference between how Blade handles a blade versus how Sunny handles a blade. Blade's been working with a blade for years, I guess, and Sunny's just been given one, and it's the difference in the way that they might handle props that will really kind of start to differentiate the different lives and experiences they've had.
And also the props that are identified as survival, and the props that are aspirational, and how that might, inform the storytelling of the props being used and being on stage, and their relationship towards the use of them and the way they hide them, the way they hold them. That would be really interesting.
I'm just thinking as well about voice, and how an actor might think about where their voice is coming from. I mean, it's a very technical thing, but let's say, for example, Ice. We decide that Ice does have really big boots, and so really drags his feet, and so actually his voice might feel like it's dragging as well. He might decide, that actor might decide that his voice is being generated through his feet, so he might have a really dragged way of speaking. Versus, for example, maybe Gia around Poppy suddenly gets really quite girly, and suddenly because this is really attractive, guy that she, and suddenly where's her voice coming from compared to Ice, who's kind of dragging along the floor? And what are the circumstances that surround them? What's the stories that are playing out around them that affect where and how their voice might generate? And how does it change? Does Rat find more confidence through her friendship with Minnie, through the actually making peace with the idea that she might one day be able to become a girl? Does her voice develop physically in the play and also physically in her body?
I think there's also a really interesting question in terms of thinking about what we reveal and what we conceal. Rat is trying to conceal her gender, but then all of the other characters are also in different levels trying to conceal things about them, and how, for example, hair might be able to do something like that, depending on how long these young people have been on the road, and how their hair may have grown out to make it a slightly bit more feral, a bit more sort of, something they can hide behind, that sort of, it just absolutely tells a story about the conditions in which they have been living, surviving and traveling in order to get to the destination that they want, so everything that is visually manifested on a body can hopefully help to shape that story, that voice.
The idea of concealment, something we haven't talked about is obviously Blade's love for Poppy. But that's when I guess this idea of research becomes really important, right? Because Blade's love for Poppy, the cultural context of that in our culture is very different to what Blade and Poppy experience it. Because actually, as I understand it, in North Korea, the idea of homosexuality is just not even acknowledged. It's not even...
There isn't a word for it.
It's not even a word for it.
Right. I think Blade's feelings would just be so confusing. he would not see, there is no representation of what he is feeling, so he would not understand it at all. It's just very confusing to him.
Exactly, and I think also from the flip side of that for Poppy as well.
Yeah.
Because actually there's no hint of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Because he wouldn't understand that that's a thing that could happen.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important that, you know, it's moments like that when we start thinking about character, that we're not playing race, but we are absolutely using research to understand the motivations of the characters and how they might behave in those moments with the cultural context that we have around it.
Yeah. Practically, the idea was, because it was a connections play with large cast, it's always great to incorporate a chorus. And then my idea for The Forgotten was just the idea of the swathes of people who have been disappeared and repatriated and have just got lost in the very extensive, very regulated North Korean prison system. And most North Koreans that I know have family members who have disappeared and are in the North Korean prison system, and if they, dare to speak up about North Korean abuses, human rights abuses, then, these family members are found and threatened with execution. So The Forgotten represent these people who have disappeared or who've possibly died. There is a version of it, depending on director and creative team, where The Forgotten could be, you could do it as a sort of as a ghost story.
The tension that exists between wanting to honour, depict that presence of the forgotten, these people that have vanished, and the tension between wanting to avoid slipping into stereotypical or traumatized versions of East Asian bodies, Southeast Asian bodies on stage, and I think there's a really, I think to use your term, Moy, crunchy. I think there's a really good crunchy conversation to have in that as well. How do we honour the intention, these people, without slipping into lazy stereotypes of East and Southeast Asian bodies suffering pain and trauma? Because we've talked about realms, and you just mentioned the word ghost, it does feel to me that there is a version that exists, and it's probably inspired a little bit by the idea that you talk about in the play quite a lot, about them being in shadows. Mm-hmm. About it being a kind of shadowy, kind of spiritual world that exists. But also I'm really aware that my very Western view of ghosts and spirit world, underworld, whatever that might be, is very different.
So a Korean's understanding of ghosts is very different to a Western person's understanding of ghosts, because it is traditionally a country of ancestor worship, so you would probably believe in ghosts. But then I'd also say the shamanism, it's very female. It's very sort of inspired by the natural world. The symbolism and the rites are very beautiful. So, for a funeral, you would always dress in white. So, you could have The Forgotten more as there is a production that could have the Forgotten as sort of shamanic ghosts.
Straight away when you say chorus, and because in a very Eurocentric view, we think of a Greek chorus. Traditional Greek chorus are very uniform, actually, aren't they? And the whole point of chorus is to not stand out, right? Is to not be distinguishable from the next, which is why we use mask and all the rest of it. But we talked a little bit about what happens if you do the complete opposite, and we really honour the individual, actually, and we really go think about each of these people that have disappeared into the system, so that the chorus becomes almost like an anti-chorus, in a way. And what does that do? What happens then if we actually make them really tangible people that do exist in our world? And then I think a little bit about, well, what are the other production elements that can help make them feel in a separate realm? So yes, they might exist, yes, they're tangible, yes, they're specific and distinct, but how do we make them feel in a different realm to the Free9?
Yeah, I think the question would be, if they're very specific and detailed, how do we locate them period-wise in terms of the clothing? And how do we then incorporate elements of the traditional dress? It almost felt like a list of stage directions when you described the forgotten. It was like a wisp of, and the wisp itself was really, really interesting as a word to describe the chorus, the forgotten. Like, it's light, it appears, it disappears, it is present, but it's not. It's omnipresent, then it's underground or something, and actually it permeates itself into the landscape, not just as the physical landscape, but as the body, as the experience that shapes the body, and then the body as a vessel that communicates the story of history and of attachment, of familial love, of ancestral worship, and all those things. That's sort of really interesting, and I think there's a sort of a massive world to explore in terms of like the sound design behind that, how that could almost immerse the Dorfman, that space, so that it feels like actually the audience are transported into this realm where it's not, they're not just watching, but they're actually participating in that in some way.